September 4, 1950, las 8:47 p.m. Bumpy Johnson sat in a corner booth at Morton's Steakhouse on West 52nd Street between 5th Avenue and 6th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, a high-end establishment that had opened in 1946 and had quickly established itself as one of the city's premier dining destinations for business executives, entertainment industry figures, and wealthy patrons who appreciated the combination of excellent food and discreet service that allowed them to conduct private conversations without concern about being overheard or interrupted. Johnson was there for a business dinner with two associates from his Harlem operations and an Italian businessman named Salvatore Maranzano Jr., the nephew of the late mob boss, and a man who now controlled several legitimate import-export companies that Johnson used for money laundering purposes. And the four men had just finished their steaks and were working through their second bottle of a night Bordeaux that cost $75 when the incident occurred that would set in motion a series of events culminating in the complete financial destruction of a man who had built a multi-dollar industrial empire over 23 years. Morton's Steakhouse occupied the ground floor and basement of a limestone building that had previously housed a failed French restaurant, and the current owner, a man named Gerald Morton, who had made his fortune in the hotel industry before deciding to enter the restaurant business, had invested nearly $200,000 renovating the space into something that reflected his vision of sophisticated American dining, with dark wood paneling imported from England, crystal chandelier purchased from a bankrupt Austrian hotel, leather booth seating that could accommodate 6 people comfortably, starched white tablecloths, and a wine cellar that stocked over 500 labels ranging from modest California vintages to rare French and Italian bottles that cost more than most working families earned in a month. The clientele on any given evening consisted of corporate executives celebrating closed deals, Broadway producers, entertaining investors, lawyers from the white shoe firms that occupied office buildings throughout Midtown, and occasionally organized crime figures, like Johnson, who had enough money and sophistication to blend into the environment of expensive suits and quiet conversations about stock portfolios and real estate investments. The waitress serving Johnson's table was a woman named Dorothy Hayes, a 32-year-old Negro woman who had been working at Morton's since it opened in 1946, making her one of the restaurant's longest-tenured employees, and certainly its most experienced. Negro staff member in an establishment that employed mostly white waiters for front-of-house service, but maintained a small number of Negro employees for positions that white patrons found acceptable for people of color, such as dishwashers, and occasionally waitresses, if they demonstrated the kind of professionalism and deference that made white customers comfortable being served by someone darker than themselves. Dorothy was exceptionally good at her job, which required not just the ability to remember complex orders and serve food efficiently, but also the emotional intelligence to navigate the complicated racial dynamics of serving wealthy white customers who expected a particular kind of servile behavior from Negro staff, and who could become hostile or aggressive if they perceived any deviation from those expectations. And she had developed over her 4 years at Morton's a professional demeanor that allowed her to maintain her dignity while providing the kind of service that earned substantial tips from customers who appreciated competence even when it came wrapped in black skin. Johnson had requested Dorothy as his server when he arrived that evening, not because he knew her personally, but because he made it his practice, when dining in white establishments, to request Negro staff whenever possible, both as a gesture of solidarity with working people who faced the same racism he faced, and as a tactical decision to ensure that at least one person in the room had reason to be sympathetic to him if anything went wrong. Dorothy had served his table efficiently throughout the evening, bringing drinks and food promptly, answering questions about menu items with professional courtesy, and maintaining the slightly formal but friendly tone that characterized good service in expensive restaurants. And Johnson had responded by treating her with the same respect he would give any competent professional, speaking to her directly rather than through his companions, saying please and thank you, and already planning to leave a 50% tip on a bill that would total approximately $140 once they finished their wine and coffee. At 8:47 p.m., a man entered Morton's Steakhouse, accompanied by 3 other men who were clearly subordinates or business associates, based on the way they deferred to him, and positioned themselves slightly behind him as they approached the host stand. And the man who led this group was Harold Whitmore, the founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Industrial Manufacturing, a company that produced steel components for construction and machinery, and that employed over 800 workers across 3 factories in Queens, the Bronx, and Newark, generating annual revenues that business reporters estimated at $15 million, and providing Whitmore with a personal fortune that allowed him to maintain a townhouse on the Upper East Side, a summer home in the Hamptons, and a lifestyle characterized by expensive restaurants, luxury auto, and the kind of casual arrogance that came from 3 decades of being told by subordinates that his every opinion was correct, and his every decision was brilliant. Whitmore was drunk. Not falling down drunk, or slurring his words drunk, but drunk enough that his movements were slightly uncoordinated and his judgment was impaired in ways that would prove catastrophic over the next few minutes. And he had apparently been drinking for several hours, based on the flushed appearance of his face and the loud volume of his voice as he demanded a table from the host, who was a young man named Peter Collins that immediately recognized Whitmore as a regular customer, who spent substantial amounts of money at the restaurant and who therefore needed to be accommodated regardless of the fact that the restaurant was fully booked, and Whitmore had no reservation. Collins scrambled to find a solution, eventually deciding to seat Whitmore's party at a table in the center of the dining room that had been reserved for another party arriving at 9:30 p.m., calculating that he could figure out alternative seating for that later reservation, and that keeping Harold Whitmore happy was more important than maintaining proper reservation protocols. Dorothy Hayes, who had just delivered coffee and dessert menus to Johnson's table, was assigned by Collins to serve Whitmore's party, a decision that Collins made primarily because Dorothy was his most experienced waitress and therefore most likely to handle a demanding customer efficiently. And Dorothy approached the table with her professional smile and her order pad ready, asking what drinks she could bring to get them started while Whitmore and his 3 companions were still settling into their chairs and barely paying attention to her presence. What happened next occurred so quickly that several witnesses later disagreed on specific details, but the essential facts were not disputed by anyone who saw it. Dorothy stood beside Whitmore's chair with her order pad ready, while Whitmore continued a conversation with one of his companions about a labor dispute at his Newark factory. And when Dorothy attempted to ask again about drinks after waiting approximately 15 seconds for acknowledgement, Whitmore turned his head toward her with an expression of irritation, and said in a voice loud enough to be heard by several nearby tables, "I'll tell you when I'm ready to order. Girl, now get away from this table until I call for you, T. Word, girl," spoken with a particular emphasis and condescension, hung in the air for a moment, and Dorothy, who had experienced similar treatment countless times over 4 years of serving white customers and who had learned to absorb such insults without visible reaction because responding would mean losing her job, simply nodded and began to step away from the table. But as she turned, her order pad brushed against Whitmore's water glass, not knocking it over but causing it to shift slightly on the tablecloth, and this trivial accident triggered something in Whitmore's alcohol-impaired brain that transformed his irritation into rage. He stood up from his chair with surprising speed for a man of his size and intoxication level, reached out and grabbed Dorothy's wrist with his left hand, and with his right hand delivered an open-handed slap across her face that was hard enough to snap her head to the side and cause her to stumble backward, nearly falling before catching herself against an empty chair at the adjacent table. The sound of the slap carried throughout the dining room, a sharp crack that caused conversations to stop and heads to turn, and for several seconds there was complete silence in Morton Steakhouse as approximately 60 patrons and staff members processed what they had just witnessed. Dorothy stood frozen where she had caught herself, one hand raised to her face where a red mark was already forming on her cheek, her order pad on the floor where it had fallen when Whitmore grabbed her wrist, and her expression showing not anger or shock, but rather the kind of calculated stillness that comes from understanding that any reaction would make the situation worse, that as a Negro woman working in a white establishment, she had no recourse against a wealthy white customer who had just assaulted her, that fighting back or even protesting would result in her being fired and possibly arrested for causing a disturbance, and that her only option was to absorb the violence and humiliation the way she had absorbed countless smaller humiliations. Every day she worked in a place where people who looked like her were considered inherently inferior to people who looked like Harold Whitmore. Whitmore, still standing, pointed his finger at Dorothy and said in the same loud voice that had carried throughout the dining room, "That's what happens when you people don't know your place. You touch my property. You interrupt me when I'm talking. You act like you have the right to stand there breathing the same air as your betters, and you think there won't be consequences. Have you ever watched someone commit an act so brazen, so publicly humiliating, so casually cruel, that it reveals something fundamental about how they view other human beings, where the cruelty isn't hidden or disguised, but performed openly, because the perpetrator genuinely believes they have the right to inflict violence without facing any consequences, where they're so secure in their position of privilege that they can assault a working woman in front of 60 witnesses and expect everyone to simply accept it as the natural order of things. Subscribe to Timeless. Bosses to understand how the most dangerous racists are the ones who don't hide their hatred but perform it publicly because they've never faced real consequences for their actions, and how meeting someone who can actually deliver those consequences changes everything. They think they know about power and privilege. Bumpy Johnson had watched the entire incident unfold from his corner booth 20 feet away, and he had watched it with the kind of focused attention that his associates had learned to recognize as dangerous. The stillness that preceded calculated violence, the calm before someone who understood power at its most fundamental level decided exactly how to demonstrate the difference between what Harold Whitmore thought power meant and what it actually meant when wielded by someone who understood systems and leverage, and how to destroy a man without ever laying hands on him personally. Johnson set down his wine glass with careful precision, placed his napkin on the table with deliberate slowness, and stood up from the booth with the measured movements of someone who had already made his decision and was now simply executing a plan that had formed completely in his mind during the seconds it took for Whitmore to slap Dorothy Hayes and deliver his speech about people knowing their place. He walked across the dining room toward Whitmore's table while the entire restaurant watched in silence, and his 2 associates from Harlem remained seated but alert, their hands positioned where they could reach weapons if the situation required them, while Salvatore Maranzano Jair watched with the professional interest of someone who understood that he was about to witness something significant in the unwritten rules that governed interactions between criminals and legitimate businessmen in New York City's complex social hierarchy. Johnson stopped approximately 3 feet from where Whitmore stood, close enough to speak in a normal voice that would carry 2 nearby tables, but not close enough to be threatening, in a way that might provoke a physical response, and he addressed Whitmore in the same calm, controlled tone he had used earlier when ordering his dinner. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Johnson said, and his voice carried none of the anger or outrage that one might expect from someone confronting an act of violence. Instead, it carried the absolute certainty of someone stating an observable fact about objective reality, like pointing out that the sky was blue or that dropped objects fell downward due to gravity. Whitmore, who was still processing the unexpected development of a Negro man in an expensive suit approaching him rather than retreating or deferring, as every social convention of 1950 New York suggested such a person should do when confronted by a wealthy white man, stared at Johnson with a mixture of confusion and contempt before finally responding. "And who the hell are you?" Whitmore demanded, his voice carrying the aggressive confidence of someone who assumed that his wealth and white skin gave him authority over any Negro man regardless of circumstances, continuing, "This is none of your business. This is between me and the help, and if you don't get back to whatever table let you in here, I'll have management throw you out on the street where you belong." Johnson smiled, and it was the same cold smile that everyone who knew him had learned to fear, because it meant that the moment for negotiation or warning had passed and that consequences were now inevitable and inescapable. And he said in that same calm voice that somehow carried more menace than any threat could convey, "My name is Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Some people call me Bumpy, and I'm going to explain something to you very carefully so that later when your life falls apart and you're trying to understand how it happened, You'll remember this exact moment and this exact conversation." He paused to let Whitmore process the name, to let him understand, if he had the intelligence to understand it, that he was not talking to some random Negro patron who could be dismissed or intimidated. And then Johnson continued in a voice that remained calm, but that carried undertones of absolute finality. "You just assaulted a woman in front of 60 witnesses," Johnson said, and he gestured to indicate the dining room, where every patron and staff member was watching the confrontation with the focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing something extraordinary. Continuing, "You assaulted her because she's Negro and because you believe that being white and wealthy means you can do whatever you want to people you consider inferior, and you did it publicly because you wanted everyone to see that you could commit violence without consequences, that your privilege protected you from accountability." Whitmore attempted to interrupt, but Johnson kept speaking, his voice never rising, but somehow intensifying in a way that commanded attention and silence. "What you don't understand," Johnson said, "is that I own more of this city than you could buy with everything you have, that I have connections that extend from the Italian mob families who control half of New York's commerce, to the union locals that represent every worker in your factories, to the Negro churches that could organize protests at your business locations, to the bankers who currently extend you credit based on the assumption that your company will remain profitable, and all of those connections are about to receive phone calls explaining exactly what you did tonight and exactly why it would be in their interests to stop doing business with Harold Whitmore and Whitmore Industrial Manufacturing." He took a step closer to close enough now that only the people at the immediate adjacent tables could hear his next words clearly, and he said in a voice that dropped to something just above a whisper but that somehow carried more weight than any shout, "In 30 days, your company will be worthless. Your factories will be shut down by strikes and supply shortages. Your credit lines will be called in by banks who suddenly discover irregularities in your financial statements. And every business relationship you've built over 23 years will evaporate, because I'm going to make it very clear to everyone who matters in this city that associating with you carries costs they're not willing to pay." Johnson straightened, adjusted his tie, and addressed his next words to Dorothy Hayes, who was still standing frozen with her hand on her cheek, speaking in a tone that was gentle and respectful, in sharp contrast to the cold certainty he had used with Whitmore. "Miss Hayes," Johnson said, and the use of her name, which she had learned earlier in the evening from reading her name tag, combined with the courtesy title Miss rather than the degrading girl that Whitmore had used, created a contrast that everyone in the restaurant registered. "I apologize that you had to experience this violence, and I want you to know that it will not go unanswered. You deserve to work in an environment where customers treat you with the respect that any professional deserves, and while I cannot undo what just happened, I can promise you that the man who did this will understand by the end of this month exactly what it costs to assault a Negro woman while Bumpy Johnson is watching." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracted 5 $100 bills, and placed them on the nearest table, saying, "This is for your medical expenses, for any time you need to take off work, and for the emotional distress of being assaulted at your workplace. And if you need anything else, anyone in Harlem can tell you how to reach me." Dorothy, who was still processing everything that had happened in the last 2 minutes, took the money with shaking hands and said in a voice that was barely audible, "Thank you, sir." Johnson nodded to her, turned back to Whitmore one final time, and delivered his final words with the certainty of someone who had already seen the future and knew exactly how it would unfold. "September 4th, 1950, Johnson said, "Remember this date, because this is the day you learned that privilege without wisdom is just rope that privileged people use to hang themselves when they forget that power is not about money or skin color, but about understanding who you can afford to disrespect and who you cannot, and you just disrespected someone under my protection in my presence." He turned and walked back to his table where Salvatore Jua was already standing and preparing to leave because he understood from 30 years of involvement in organized crime that Johnson had just declared war on Harold Whitmore, and that anyone associated with Johnson needed to demonstrate solidarity by departing immediately to emphasize the social exile that Whitmore was about to experience. Johnson's two Harlem associates stood as well, and the four men walked out of Morton's Steakhouse without paying their bill, which was itself a message about jurisdiction and authority, because Morton's owner, Gerald Morton, who had watched the entire incident from near the kitchen entrance, understood that attempting to collect payment from Bumpy Johnson after what had just occurred would be both impossible and dangerous. Outside on West 52nd Street, Salvatore Maranzano Jr. was the first to speak, asking the question that everyone in Johnson's presence wanted answered, saying, "How far do you want to take this?" Johnson, who was lighting a cigarette while standing in the glow of the restaurant's exterior lights, answered without hesitation, "All the way. I want Harold Whitmore destroyed completely. I want his company bankrupted. I want his reputation in ruins. I want every person who saw what he did tonight too. Understand that there are still consequences for racism, even in a city where racism is legal and socially acceptable, and I want it done in a way that makes it clear to every other wealthy white man in New York that the era when they could casually assault Negro workers without facing any repercussions is ending." The campaign to destroy Harold Whitmore and Whitmore Industrial Manufacturing began the following morning at 6:30 a.m., when Johnson placed the first of what would become dozens of phone calls over the next 72 hours, and this first call was to Frank Costello, the Italian mob boss who controlled the Luciano crime family and with whom Johnson had maintained a partnership since 1946 that gave him autonomy over Harlem in exchange for tribute payments and mutual cooperation on matters affecting their respective territories, and Costello answered his private line on the second ring with the alertness of someone who had been awake for hours, despite the early hour. Johnson explained what had happened at Morton's Steakhouse in precise detail, not exaggerating or editorializing, but simply laying out the facts of Dorothy Hayes being slapped by Harold Whitmore's speech about people knowing their place, and Johnson's public promise that Whitmore would face consequences. And when he finished the recitation, Costello was silent for several seconds before responding in a voice that carried the weight of someone making a decision that would affect multiple business relationships and political alliances. "This Whitmore, Costello Said, he supplies steel components to several construction companies we have interests in. His factories produce parts that go into buildings we're invested in, and cutting him off means finding alternative suppliers, which will be expensive and time-consuming. But what he did was unacceptable. It was disrespectful to you, which means it was disrespectful to our partnership, and it demonstrated the kind of public racism that makes it harder for all of us to operate when newspapers start writing stories about discrimination and government starts passing laws about equal rights because white businessmen can't control themselves around Negro employees." Costello paused, and Johnson could hear him lighting a cigar, could hear the match striking and the puff of breath that indicated Costello was thinking through implications while performing the familiar ritual of preparing to smoke. And then Costello continued with the decisiveness of someone who had calculated costs and benefits and reached a conclusion. "I'll make calls today to every construction company and contractor that we control or influence," Costello sighed, "and I'll explain that Whitmore Industrial Manufacturing is no longer an acceptable supplier due to management issues, which is code language that everyone in our business understands, means someone has offended someone important, and is now being punished. And within a week, Whitmore will start losing contracts, and within 2 weeks, he'll be scrambling to replace 20% of his revenue. And within a month, he'll be facing cash flow problems that will force him to either secure emergency financing or start laying off workers." Johnson thanked him and ended the call, satisfied that the first layer of pressure was now established, and his second call was to Raymond Torres, president of Local 285 of the United Steelworkers Union, which represented the workers at Whitmore's 3 factories, and which had been negotiating with Whitmore for 6 months about wage increases and improved safety conditions, negotiations that had stalled because Whitmore refused to meet the union's demands and because he had threatened to move operations to non-union facilities in southern states if the union called a strike. Torres answered his office phone at 7:15 a.m. and listened to Johnson's account of what had happened at Morton's with the focused attention of someone who understood that this information represented not just a story about racism but an opportunity to extract concessions from an employer who was about to become vulnerable. Johnson explained that he was going to destroy Whitmore's business relationships and credit access over the next month, which would put Whitmore in a position where he desperately needed his factories to keep operating at full capacity to generate the cash flow necessary to service his debts, and Torres immediately understood that this situation gave the union leverage it had not possessed during the previous 6 months of fruitless negotiations. "If I call a strike now," Torres said, thinking through the implications while speaking, while Whitmore is also losing contracts and facing credit problems, he'll have no choice but to settle on our terms because he can't afford a prolonged work stoppage when he's already hemorrhaging money from other sources, and even if he threatens to move operations south, he won't be able to secure financing for new facilities when banks are calling in his existing loans, so he'll be trapped between meeting union demands or watching his company collapse completely." Johnson confirmed that this was exactly his analysis and suggested that Torres might want to coordinate the strike timing with other pressure points that would be hitting Whitmore simultaneously over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and Torres agreed enthusiastically, already planning how to present the strike to his membership as a response to Whitmore's public racism rather than just a negotiating tactic, because framing it as a moral stand rather than an economic dispute would generate more support from both union members and the general public. The third layer of Johnson's campaign involved the Negro churches in Harlem, and between 8 a.m. and noon on September 5th, he contacted 7 senior pastors who led congregations totaling approximately 20,000 members and who had all received substantial financial support from Johnson over the years for building renovations, youth programs, scholarship funds, and community initiatives. He explained what Harold Whitmore had done to Dorothy Hayes at Morton Steakhouse and suggested that it would be appropriate for their congregations to understand that certain manufacturers in New York operated under management that considered Negro workers to be subhuman and subject to casual violence, and that perhaps it would be useful for church members who worked in purchasing departments or who made decisions about suppliers to remember this information when their employers needed steel components for construction or manufacturing projects. The pastors responded with a combination of genuine moral outrage at Whitmore's assault on Dorothy and calculated appreciation for the political opportunity that Johnson was providing them, because organizing church members around a clear case of racist violence gave them a cause that could mobilize their congregations and demonstrate their relevance to Negro community life in ways that abstract sermons about sin and redemption could not. And within days several of these pastors had organized what they called the Committee for Dignity in the Workplace, which held rallies outside Whitmore's factories demanding that he be prosecuted for assault and that his company institute policies protecting workers from management violence, generating newspaper coverage, and creating a public relations nightmare for Whitmore, who found himself characterized in Negro newspapers throughout New York as the epitome of racist employer brutality. The fourth layer involved banking relationships, and this required more subtle maneuvering because banks operated under different rules than suppliers or unions and because financial institutions were supposedly neutral parties that made lending decisions based on objective assessments of creditworthiness rather than personal favors or political considerations. But Johnson understood that banks were no more neutral than any other institution in a city where personal relationships and insider information shaped most important decisions, and he had cultivated relationships over the previous decade with 3 senior officers at Manhattan banks who handled commercial lending and who appreciated the substantial deposits that Johnson's various legitimate businesses maintained at their institutions. Johnson met with each of these bankers separately over lunch on September 6th and 7th, explaining in general terms that Harold Whitmore was facing serious business difficulties that would likely affect his ability to service existing debt obligations, and suggesting that it might be prudent for their institutions to review Whitmore's credit facilities and perhaps consider whether his loan should be called in, or at minimum, restructured with higher interest rates and more stringent covenants. Given the deteriorating business situation, He provided enough specific information about contract cancellations and labor disputes to make his warnings seem credible, and while he never explicitly stated that he was orchestrating Whitmore's difficulties, the bankers were sophisticated enough to understand the subtext and to recognize that Johnson was giving them advance warning, a bad loan situation so they could protect their institutions by reducing exposure before other lenders discovered the same problems. Within 10 days, 2 of Whitmore's 3 primary banks had sent letters demanding immediate meetings to discuss loan restructuring, citing concerns about covenant violations related to customer concentration and labor relations. And while these concerns were technically legitimate, given the contract cancellations and impending strike, the timing suggested that someone had encouraged the banks to take action more aggressively than they otherwise might have done. The third bank, which had a more substantial loan portfolio with Whitmore, and which could not easily reduce its exposure without causing the entire credit structure to collapse, maintained its existing facilities, but increased its monitoring significantly, and began preparing documentation that would allow rapid action if Whitmore's situation deteriorated further. The fifth layer of pressure involved city government inspectors, and this required activating the complex network of small favors and corrupt relationships that Johnson had built over years of operating in New York's gray economy, where businesses needed permits and licenses and inspections that could be expedited or delayed depending on one's relationships with the bureaucrats who controlled these processes. Johnson contacted officials in the Department of Buildings, the Fire Department, the Department of Health, and the Department of Labor, all of whom owed him favors, or who accepted regular payments in exchange for their cooperation with various Harlem businesses that needed flexible enforcement of regulations that were technically violated by most establishments but selectively enforced based on political considerations. He requested that Whitmore's 3 factories receive the most thorough and rigorous inspections permitted under city and state regulations, with particular attention to safety violations, environmental compliance, fire code adherence, and labor law compliance. And within 2 weeks, inspectors had descended on all 3 facilities simultaneously and had discovered sufficient violations to justify combined fines totaling $42,000 and closure orders on 2 factories until major safety improvements were completed, improvements that would cost an estimated $115,000 and require 4 to 6 weeks of construction work, during which the affected facilities could not operate at full capacity. The 6th layer, which was perhaps the most psychologically devastating for Whitmore, involved a systematic campaign to destroy his social standing and personal reputation within the business and social circles where he had operated for decades. Johnson arranged for Negro newspaper reporters to investigate Whitmore's history and found, not surprisingly, that the Morton Steakhouse incident was not an isolated example of his racism, but rather part of a pattern that included discriminatory hiring practices at his factories, underpayment of Negro workers relative to white workers performing identical jobs, and multiple incidents of verbal abuse toward Negro employees that had never been reported to authorities because those employees understood that complaining would result in immediate termination. These stories were published in the Amsterdam News, the New York Age, and several other Negro newspapers, with substantial circulations in black communities throughout the metropolitan area. And while Whitmore could have dismissed coverage in Negro publications as irrelevant to his primarily white customer base and social circle, the stories were picked up by several mainstream newspapers whose reporters recognized that the Dorothy Hayes assault, combined with the documented pattern of discrimination, created a compelling narrative about racism in New York's industrial sector, and within 3 weeks, Whitmore found himself characterized in the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, and the Daily News as a symbol of the kind of casual racism that civil rights activists were fighting against. His invitations to charitable events dried up as organizations decided they could not afford the public relations risk of associating with someone who had become notorious for assaulting a Negro waitress. His memberships in business organizations became controversial, as other members questioned whether someone with his record should be allowed to represent their industries, and his social circle contracted as friends and business associates made the calculated decision that maintaining relationships with Harold Whitmore carried more costs than benefits in a city where racial attitudes were slowly shifting, and where being publicly associated with an unrepentant racist created risks for one's own reputation and business relationships. Have you ever watched someone's entire world collapse in slow motion, where every structure they built over decades starts to fail simultaneously because someone who understood systems better than they did identified all the load-bearing supports and removed them methodically, where the destruction wasn't dramatic or violent, but rather systematic and comprehensive, where pride and racism became the rope that hung them when they finally encountered someone who could coordinate pressure across multiple domains simultaneously, and who had both the intelligence to plan the campaign and the connections to execute it perfectly. Like this video, if you understand that true power isn't about individual acts of violence, but about understanding how complex systems work and knowing which levers to pull to make those systems. Destroy your enemies while you watch from a distance with clean hands. Whitmore attempted to fight back, hiring lawyers who sent Sissandi's letters to newspapers, and who threatened Johnson with lawsuits for tortious interference with business relationships, but the lawyers quickly discovered that Johnson had been careful never to make any explicit threats or take any direct actions that could be proven in court, that every pressure point had been activated through intermediaries with their own legitimate reasons for cutting ties with Andate. Coordination of the campaign was so sophisticated that establishing legal liability would require proving a conspiracy involving dozens of parties across multiple industries who would all deny that they had acted at Johnson's direction, rather than making independent business decisions based on Whitmore's deteriorating situation. Whitmore also attempted to negotiate directly with Johnson, reaching out through intermediaries who suggested that Whitmore was willing to apologize publicly to Dorothy Hayes, make a substantial financial settlement, donate to Negro charitable organizations, and reform his employment practices if Johnson would call off the campaign. But the response that came back through these channels was consistent and unambiguous. Johnson was not interested in apologies or settlements or reforms, because the point was not to rehabilitate Harold Whitmore, but to destroy him completely as an example to every other white businessman in New York who might think they could assault Negro workers without facing consequences. By October 4th, exactly 30 days after the incident at Morton's Steakhouse, Whitmore Industrial Manufacturing was facing a perfect storm of business difficulties that made profitable operation impossible, with contract cancellations having eliminated approximately 35% of its revenue, union strikes having shut down 2 of its 3 factories and reduced production capacity by 60%, bank pressure having forced expensive loan restructuring that increased interest costs substantially, safety violations and closure orders having required unplanned capital expenditures totaling $115,000, and negative publicity having made it extremely difficult to attract new customers who were increasingly reluctant to associate with a company whose CEO had become synonymous with racism and workplace violence. On October 12th, Harold Whitmore, who had built his company over 23 years, from a small machine shop employing 12 workers to an industrial manufacturer employing over 800 workers across 3 facilities and generating $15 million in annual revenue, filed for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 11, citing unexpected business difficulties including labor disputes, contract cancellations, and cash flow problems that made it impossible to service existing debt. Obligations. The bankruptcy filing was covered in business newspapers as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overleverage and poor labor relations, with most reporters failing to recognize, or at least failing to report, that Whitmore's collapse had been orchestrated by someone who understood that destroying a business required not violence or dramatic action, but rather systematic pressure, applied simultaneously across multiple critical domains in ways that overwhelmed a target's ability to respond effectively. The bankruptcy proceedings revealed that Whitmore had personally guaranteed many of his company's loans, which meant that the corporate bankruptcy would likely be followed by personal bankruptcy once creditors pursued collection against his personal assets. And within 6 months, Whitmore had lost not just his company, but his Upper East Side townhouse, his Hampton summer home, his stock portfolio, and essentially everything he had accumulated over 3 decades of business success, leaving him at age 57 with no company, no wealth, no social standing, and no prospects for rebuilding because his reputation as the man whose racism cost him his fortune made him unemployable in any senior management position and made investors unwilling to back any new venture he might propose. Dorothy Hayes, the waitress whose assault had triggered the entire sequence of events, received a settlement from Whitmore's bankruptcy estate totaling $8,000, which, combined with the $500 Johnson had given her the night of the incident, represented more money than she had earned in the previous 3 years of working at Morton's Steakhouse, and she used the money to enroll in a nursing program that allowed her to leave restaurant work entirely and enter a profession where she could use her intelligence and her interpersonal skills in an environment that offered better pay and more respect than serving white customers, who viewed her as inherently inferior. She remained in contact with Johnson for the rest of his life, occasionally sending him letters, updating him on her progress, and thanking him for defending her when no one else would have considered a Negro waitress worthy of that kind of protection. And Johnson kept those letters in a locked box in his apartment, along with other correspondence and documents that he considered important to his legacy. The story of what happened to Harold Whitmore became legendary in New York's business community and served multiple purposes, depending on who was telling it and what lessons they wanted to emphasize. For Negro workers throughout the city, it became a parable about the possibility of accountability for racist violence, a story that suggested white employers could not assault black workers with complete impunity if the circumstances were right and if someone with sufficient power decided to intervene. For white businessmen, it became a cautionary tale about the importance of treating all customers and employees with minimum courtesy regardless of their race, not because of moral principles, but because insulting the wrong Negro person might result in encountering someone like Bumpy Johnson, who had the connections and sophistication to destroy your business through methods that legal systems could not prevent or punish. For Johnson himself, the destruction of Whitmore Industrial Manufacturing represented a principle that governed much of his decision-making throughout his career, which was that power existed not primarily to accumulate wealth or control territory, though those were important objectives, but rather to defend dignity and impose consequences on people who believed their privilege exempted them from accountability. He had spent money on the Whitmore campaign, had called in favors that he might have used for other purposes, had devoted time and attention to coordinating a complex operation that brought him no direct financial benefit, and he had done all of this because Harold Whitmore had slapped Dorothy Hayes in his presence, and because allowing that violence to go unanswered would have sent a message that even Bumpy Johnson's protection had limits, and that Negro workers remained vulnerable to casual assault from white employers, regardless of who was watching. The incident also demonstrated what distinguished Johnson from many of his contemporaries in organized crime, which was his understanding that criminal power could serve purposes beyond criminal enrichment, that the networks and connections he had built through illegal enterprises could be weaponized to address injustices that legal systems would not address, and that his reputation in Harlem depended not just on his ability to run profitable numbers operations, but on his willingness to use his power to defend Negro people against the kind of racism that was endemic to 1950 New York, but that could sometimes be punished if someone with sufficient resources and connections decided to make an example of a particularly egregious violator. In Harlem's barbershops and churches and corner stores, the story of Harold Whitmore's destruction was told and retold with details that became more dramatic with each telling, but that preserved the essential truth that Dorothy Hayes had been slapped by a wealthy white man, that Bumpy Johnson had witnessed the assault, and that within 30 days the white man's company had collapsed and his fortune had evaporated and his reputation had been destroyed, all without Johnson ever, personally, committing any act of violence or breaking any law that prosecutors could prove, simply by making phone calls and activating connections and coordinating pressure across multiple systems simultaneously, in a campaign that was so sophisticated and so comprehensive that Whitmore never had any chance of surviving once Johnson decided he needed to be destroyed. Morton's Steakhouse, where the incident had occurred, instituted new employee protection policies within 2 weeks of the assault, making it clear to all staff that management would not tolerate customers abusing employees, regardless of how much money those customers spent or how important they considered themselves, and Gerald Morton personally apologized to Dorothy Hayes and offered her a management position with increased pay, though she declined because she had already decided to leave. Restaurant work? Entirely. The restaurant's business actually increased following the publicity around the Whitmore incident, as Negro patrons who had previously avoided the establishment because they assumed it maintained subtle discrimination policies began visiting specifically because they knew that Bumpy Johnson had demonstrated that the restaurant's management would not accept racist behavior from white customers. For Harold Whitmore, there was no redemption or recovery or even dignified obscurity, because his name had become too closely associated with the incident at Morton's and with the subsequent business collapse to allow him to disappear quietly into retirement. He spent his remaining years, which lasted until his death from a heart attack in 1964 at age 70, working in low-level management positions at companies that either didn't know his history or were desperate enough for experienced managers that they were willing to overlook it, and he never rebuilt any significant wealth or social standing, remaining until his death a living example of what happened when someone who thought privilege made them untouchable discovered that power in New York belonged not to those who could afford expensive restaurants and summer homes in the Hamptons, but to those who understood how systems worked and who could coordinate pressure across multiple domains simultaneously to destroy enemies while maintaining plausible deniability. The incident on September 4, 1950 had lasted less than 3 minutes from the moment Harold Whitmore slapped Dorothy Hayes to the moment Bumpy Johnson walked out of Morton's Steakhouse, but the consequences of those 3 minutes extended across 30 days of coordinated destruction that eliminated a company employing 800 workers and generating $15 million in annual revenue. And the story entered Harlem's collective memory as proof that power exercised intelligently and systematically could defend Negro dignity in ways that legal systems would not defend it, that racial justice could sometimes be achieved through informal networks and strategic retaliation when formal channels failed, and that Bumpy Johnson's protection meant something real and substantial rather than just symbolic or rhetorical, because anyone who harmed a Negro person under his protection would discover that crossing Bumpy Johnson meant facing consequences that were comprehensive, devastating, and utterly inescapable, regardless of how much money or social standing or white privilege the transgressor thought protected them from accountability.